Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a man you think you know. You grew up with him, not personally, but in that deep, quiet way that certain stories become so woven into you that they feel like your own memory. You carried his daughter's books home from the library. You dog-eared the pages. You watched him on television, broad-shouldered and steady, with a fiddle tucked under his chin and a laugh that could fill a prairie sky. Charles Ingalls, Pa. The beloved father of the American frontier, the man who could build a house with bare hands, survive a blizzard on nothing but cornmeal and iron-willed determination, and still find time to play a reel so sweet it made your heart ache. That man was real. But tonight, we're not telling his story the way the books told it. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the final chapter of Charles Phillip Ingalls, the part that never made it into print, the part that Laura herself folded up like a worn letter and tucked away somewhere she never looked again. We're going to walk through the last 7 years of his life in a quiet house in Smet, South Dakota, where a man who had spent 4 decades pushing against every horizon finally sat down, and where the heart that had carried him through all of it slowly, quietly, began to give out. We're going to talk about what really happened on June 8th, 1902, when the fiddle finally fell silent. And we're going to talk about the funeral, the one that his most famous daughter, 650 miles away in Missouri, came dangerously close to missing altogether. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Tell me if you already knew any of this, or if tonight is the first night somebody is finally telling you the truth. Get comfortable, dim the lights if you want, and listen closely, because the real story of Pa Ingalls is sadder, more complicated, and more quietly beautiful than anything Laura ever put on the page, and she loved him more than words could carry, which is saying something for a woman who became one of the most beloved writers in American history. Let us go back. Not to the beginning of the books, not to the once upon a time in the big woods of Wisconsin beginning. The real beginning. January 10th, 1836. Cuba, New York. Charles Phillip Ingalls enters the world as the fourth of 11 children, born to Lansford Whiting Ingalls and Laura Louise Colby in a small settled town in Allegheny County. Cuba, New York in the 1830s is not the frontier. It is not the wild edge of anything. It is a place with churches and neighbours and wooden storefronts and the kind of community where a family can plant itself and grow for generations, if they are the staying kind. Charles is not the staying kind. He learns to hunt and farm and fiddle the way boys in rural New York learned everything in that era, by watching, by doing, and by the unsparing instruction of necessity. He is capable from the beginning. He is warm. He has that particular quality of person who enters a room and makes it feel more alive, who can make children laugh and old men nod and women breathe a little easier simply by being present. He is also, from the beginning, looking at the horizon. That restlessness matters more than almost anything else about him, because the entire arc of Charles Ingalls' life, the 20-plus moves, the succession of homesteads, the string of fresh starts and abandoned claims, all of it springs from that particular fever that settled into certain men of his generation. The West was calling. It was always calling. In the newspapers and the land office pamphlets and the endless stories that came back from men who had gone out and come back richer, or not come back at all. And Charles Ingalls was exactly the kind of man who answered that call every time it rang. By the time he meets Caroline Lake Quiner in the late 1850s, he is already watching the western sky. Caroline, steady, quietly brilliant, deeply practical, and possessed of a patience that would have exhausted a saint, marries him in February of 1860 in Concord, Wisconsin. She is 21 years old. He is 24. They begin their life together in the big woods, in that small log cabin where the books begin, where everything is warm and firelit and full of Pa's fiddle music. But the big woods could not hold him, and that is where the real story begins. You're standing at the edge of a field in Kansas. The year is 1869. The ground beneath your feet is red-brown and vast, running flat to a horizon that seems impossibly far away. The wind is warm and carries the smell of dry grass and something else. Call it possibility. The particular frontier scent that men like Charles Ingalls chased their entire lives. Behind you is a small log cabin that Charles built himself in Verdigris Township, Montgomery County. Ahead of you is Kansas sky, and everything it promises. They were not supposed to be there. The land Charles filed on was part of the Osage Diminished Reserve, territory still legally held by the Osage Nation, land the United States government had pledged, and then systematically, quietly, failed to protect. And Charles, like thousands of other homesteaders during those years, simply went anyway. He trusted that Washington would sort it out in the settlers' favour, the way Washington usually did in those years, and rarely in anyone else's. In 1871, the government ordered the illegal settlers to leave before the Osage could remove them by force. Charles packed the family into a covered wagon. He looked at the fields he had ploughed, the well he had dug, the cabin he had built with his own hands, and he drove away from all of it. Mary was 6, Laura was 4. A third daughter, Caroline Celestia, Carrie, was a baby in arms. This became the pattern. Not failure in the way people usually mean that word, not laziness, not incompetence, not recklessness. Something more complicated and more painful. A man who reached for things with both hands and then watched them slip away. Through drought, through grasshoppers, through government policy, through weather that had no opinion about human suffering and no interest in human effort. He moved from Kansas to Wisconsin, then to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. From Minnesota to Burr Oak, Iowa. From Iowa back to Minnesota, then onward to Dakota Territory in 1879. Each move made sense, in its own way. Each move felt like the chance that this time, finally, things would hold. He built more than most men. He also lost more than most men. And every time he lost something, he picked up the fiddle and played. There is a scene in The Long Winter, Laura's account of the brutal Dakota blizzard season of 1880 to 1881, when de Smet was cut off from supply trains for months and the townspeople were slowly, quietly starving, where Pa plays his fiddle in the darkest part of winter. The food is almost gone. The fuel is almost gone. Outside, the wind screams against the walls of the house like something that wants to get in and finish the job, and Pa plays. Not because things are fine, because they are not fine. Because the music is the only thing standing between the family and the kind of despair that, once it gets inside a house, does not leave easily. Laura describes it exactly right. She describes her father playing in the dark and the cold, and the sound of the fiddle filling the space where fear wanted to live. She writes it without sentimentality, without making it larger than it was. She lets it be what it was, a man making beauty in the dark because the dark was the only alternative. That image, that specific, heartbreaking image, is the truest thing Laura ever wrote about Charles Ingalls. Not the house building, not the hunting, not the speeches about independence and the goodness of hard work. This, a man with a fiddle and a failing winter, and children watching his face to see whether they should be afraid. He kept his face toward the fire. Whatever was happening inside him, and it must have been heavy and real and complicated, he played. Before we step into the final years of Charles Ingalls' life, and we're going to spend a great deal of time there, because those years deserve it, let us stop for a moment and account for what the man had already been through by the time he turned 60. He had lived in multiple states and territories across 4 decades. He had built and abandoned homestead after homestead. He had survived malaria in Kansas, a disease that flattened the whole family in the summer heat and nearly killed them all. He had survived the hard winter of 1880 to 1881, one of the most brutal on record in Dakota Territory, when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and blizzards came so fast that families froze to death, walking between their houses and their barns. He had survived 3 consecutive years of grasshopper plagues in Minnesota that stripped his fields clean to bare dirt and left him in debt deep enough to drown a careful man. He had survived the panic of 1893 and the collapse of prairie agriculture that came with it. He had buried his son. Charles Frederick Ingalls, Freddie Wust, was born November 1st, 1875 in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. He was the only boy. He lived 9 months and then quietly faded, growing thin and still despite everything the doctors could do, which in 1876 was not very much. Charles and Caroline buried him in Walnut Grove. They did not stop moving. They could not afford to stop. But they carried that small grave with them everywhere they went, the way parents always do. He had watched his daughter Mary lose her sight. In the spring of 1879, a severe illness swept through Mary Ingalls. Doctors at the time called it brain fever. Modern medical researchers believe it was viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain that attacked her optic nerves and left her permanently blind at the age of 14. Mary, who had been bright and studious and ambitious, who had planned to become a teacher, woke up one morning and the world was simply gone. Charles Ingalls spent years of careful, grinding economy to save enough money to send Mary to the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa. He succeeded, but the cost of it was measured in winters with barely enough food and springs with barely enough seed, and a family that wore its clothes until they fell apart at the seams. Every dollar that went toward Mary's education was a dollar that did not go toward the farm, toward the debt, toward the fragile margin between staying and losing everything again. He did all of this. He did all of this without complaint, without self-pity, without the luxury of a breakdown. He got up every morning, he put his boots on, he went to work, and by 1895, 60 years of living had finally settled into his bones. By the spring of 1895, the covered wagon era was over. Not just for Charles Ingalls, but for America itself, the US. Census Bureau had officially declared the frontier closed in 1890. The great westward migration that had defined the American story for a century had run out of room. The homesteaders who had survived the blizzards and the grasshoppers and the droughts were now simply settlers, living in towns that had post offices and churches and newspapers, and the comfortable ordinariness of established community life. Charles Ingalls was living at 210 3rd Street SW in Smet, South Dakota. Now, the house he had built himself in 1887 and 1888, a modest, well-made, practical house, because those were the only kind Charles knew how to build. A house with a real foundation, and real rooms, and a front porch where a man could sit in summer and watch the prairie light change. He had been living in it since 1889. After a lifetime of covered wagons and claim shanties, and rented rooms and temporary dwellings of every description, this was the first house Charles Ingalls had ever truly owned, as he had built it with his hands and paid for it with his labour, and it was his in a way that none of the homesteads had ever quite been his, because those had always been provisional, always one bad harvest away from being someone else's. This house was not provisional. This house was the end of the road, and it was in this house, in the quiet years after the frontier closed, that Charles Ingalls would spend what remained of his life, working, building, serving the community he had helped found, growing old, and slowly, in the way that frontier men always did, paying the bill that 40 years of hard living had been running up. Here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we move through this story. Laura Ingalls. Wilder published the first Little House book in 1932. She was 65 years old. By then her father had been dead for 30 years. The books she wrote about him, the fiddle playing, the house building, the brave and steady Pa who could fix anything and survive everything, were written from memory and grief and love, by a woman who had spent 3 decades carrying the weight of a man she could no longer ask questions. She made him immortal, but immortality has a cost. The cost is that the real man, the 60-year-old man with the failing heart and the quiet life, and the dignity of someone who had survived more than any story can contain, that man got folded away inside the legend, hidden behind the fiddle and the covered wagon, and the warm amber light of a childhood that was both true and incomplete. Tonight, we're bringing that man back out, because he deserves to be seen whole. Coming up in next chapter, we go inside the house on 3rd Street. We watch Charles Ingalls settle into the last decade of his life, and we find out what the wanderer actually did with himself when there was nowhere left to go. The answer is not what you expect, and one piece of it will change how you understand the entire Little House story. Stay with me. You want to know what a man like Charles Ingalls did when the wandering finally stopped? Here is the honest answer. He picked up his hammer. After 35 years of covered wagons and claim shanties and fields that refused to grow what he needed them to grow, after 4 states and 2 territories, and more fresh starts than most men get in 3 lifetimes, Charles Ingalls settled into the most ordinary version of himself. He became a town carpenter. He woke up every morning in the house he had built with his own 2 hands at 210 3rd Street SW in Smet, South Dakota. He drank his coffee. He put on his coat. He walked to wherever the work was, and he came home. That sounds almost too simple for a man who had driven wagons through blizzards and built houses in 3 days, and once kept a family alive on cornmeal and stubbornness through the worst winter Dakota had ever produced. But that is exactly what he did. And once you understand what those quiet years actually looked like, who was in that house, what they did to survive, who was missing and why, and what it all cost, the simplicity of it stops being simple at all. Let us start with the house, because the house matters more than it might seem. 210 3rd Street SW was not a grand house. It was not a showpiece. It was a modest, well-constructed, practical 2-story dwelling on a corner lot in a small South Dakota town, and if you had walked past it without knowing whose it was, you might not have looked twice. But Charles Ingalls had built that house in 1887 and 1888 with his own hands, the same hands that had built claim shanties and barn frames, and the kind of structures that a man raises when he has more skill than money and more time than materials. He knew how to build. He had always known how to build. By 1895, the house was theirs. Completely, undeniably, permanently theirs. No homestead residency requirement hanging over it. No banknote with teeth. No landlord with opinions. Just a house that belonged to the man who had made it. On a street in a town where people knew his name and spoke well of him when he wasn't in the room. For a man who had spent the better part of 4 decades never quite owning anything, always one bad season from losing it, always one failed harvest from packing the wagon again. This was not a small thing. The deed on that house was one of the most important documents in Charles Ingalls' life, and it never made it into any of Laura's books. By the mid-1890s, Charles Ingalls' primary occupation was listed clearly in the local records. Carpenter, not farmer, not homesteader, carpenter. The distinction matters. Farming in late 19th century South Dakota was still a gamble, dependent on rainfall that didn't come, commodity prices that collapsed without warning, seasons that could undo a year's work in a single week. But carpentry was different. Carpentry was a skill that a town needed continuously, regardless of the harvest. People always needed buildings repaired. Storefronts needed work. Houses needed additions. New families arriving in Smet needed the kind of construction that a man with decades of experience could provide better than anyone. Charles was 60 years old in 1896, and he still knew more about the way wood moved and settled and held together than men half his age. He had been building things since before most of the residents of Smet had been born. Yeah, he had built homestead cabins under time pressure and weather that would make a modern contractor weep. He had framed barns and dug wells and shingled roofs and fitted doors that swung true on their first try. Whatever the frontier had taken from him, and it had taken plenty, it had not taken that. He worked, not as hard as he had worked at 40, because no body at 60 can do what it did at 40, and Charles Ingalls had been asking more of his body than most men for a very long time. But he worked steadily, consistently, with the particular quiet competence of a man who knows his craft without needing to announce it. The neighbours knew it too. The 1900 US Census recorded his occupation simply as carpenter. 2 syllables, a lifetime of skill compressed into a single word on a government form. Here is the detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it. Charles Ingalls, the man who had moved his family 20 times across 4 states, the man who had filed homestead claims and abandoned them, the man who had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1879 with nothing but a family and a determination that the next piece of land would be the one that finally held. That man became the justice of the peace for Smet, South Dakota. Let that settle in for a moment. The justice of the peace was a civil officer. He performed marriages. He presided over minor legal disputes. He certified documents. He was, or in the practical daily administration of a small frontier town, the person the community trusted to render judgment when it needed rendering. To be appointed to that position was a statement about how the town saw you, not just as a neighbour, but as a fair man, a man whose word meant something, a man you could trust to hear both sides and decide without favour. Charles Ingalls had come a long way from the claim shanty. The community saw what the books sometimes miss. They saw a man who'd been in Smet since 1879, since before it was properly a town, since the days when the streets were being laid out and the first buildings were going up on the frozen prairie. They saw a founding member, in the truest sense of the word, a man whose roots in this place went as deep as any roots could go in a settlement that was barely 20 years old. They made him their justice of the peace, and he served. There is a church record that has survived from de Smet's first Congregational church. A charter member list dated 1882, recording the names of the 8 people who stood together to formally establish the congregation. 2 of those 8 names are Charles and Caroline Ingalls, 8 people. In a new town on the Dakota plains, 8 people who decided that this place was going to have a church, and who signed their names to that decision before the ink on the town's founding documents was even dry. Charles had first opened his store building in de Smet for church services when the congregation had nowhere else to meet. He did not own the most imposing building in town. He was not the wealthiest man in the pew. But he was there from the first Sunday, and he was still there 2 decades later, long after many of de Smet's early settlers had moved on, or given up or been buried in the very cemetery that sat on the hill at the edge of town. Every Sunday morning through those final years, Charles Ingalls walked into the church he had helped build and sat in the pew he'd sat in for 20 years. He shook hands with neighbours, he listened to sermons, he sang hymns that he knew word for word from a lifetime of singing them in 6 different churches across 4 different states. The same hymns, the same words, different buildings, same faith, same voice. The fiddle was not so different, really. Music was always how Charles Ingalls prayed. There is another community that claimed Charles Ingalls, and it is one that Laura barely mentioned in her books, but that would matter enormously at the very end of his life. The Masonic Lodge of de Smet. Freemasonry in 19th century small-town America was not simply a social club. It was a brotherhood, a network of mutual obligation and support that operated alongside the church and the courthouse as one of the primary structures of community life. Masons took care of each other. When a member fell on hard times, the lodge helped. When a member died, the lodge provided dignity, the ritual burial rites that gave a man's passing a formal sacred weight. And when a widow was left behind, the lodge helped there too. Charles Ingalls had joined the de Smet Masonic Lodge, and he maintained his membership through the final years of his life. In a town where the frontier generation was aging and dying, the lodge was not a ceremonial luxury. It was a practical lifeline. The brothers who stood at a man's grave in their Masonic aprons were making a visible promise to the living. We will not forget. We will not abandon. You are not alone. That promise would be honoured for Charles Ingalls. But that part of the story comes later. For now, in these years of the 1890s, the lodge was simply another room where Charles Ingalls belonged, another place where the town carpenter and former justice of the peace and founding church member was known and respected and welcomed. Another thread in the web of community that he had been quietly weaving for 15 years. The restless man had put down roots. They were deeper than anyone, including Charles himself, probably realised. So you cannot tell the story of that house on 3rd Street without telling the story of the women who lived in it. Carolyn Lake Quiner Ingalls was 56 years old in 1895. She had been following Charles Ingalls across the American continent since she married him in 1860, at the age of 21, and she had done so with a grace and steadiness that the books captured but never fully explained. Because the books told it from Laura's point of view, and Laura saw her mother as a quiet and dignified presence. Ma, always in the background, always capable, always calm. What the books couldn't quite show you was how much that calm had cost her over 35 years of homesteads and hard winters, and a husband who always believed the next horizon held something better. Now finally the next horizon was right here. Caroline Ingalls had her house. The real, permanent, owned outright house she had been asking for, in her quiet way, for decades. She had her church community. Her neighbours, her garden, her routines. After a lifetime of impermanence, she had permanence. And if you think that didn't matter to her, deeply, profoundly in the bones, then you have not been paying attention to who Caroline Ingalls was. She ran that household the way she ran everything, with absolute competence and minimal drama. She managed the food, the cleaning, the garden that helped supplement their modest income. She organised the occasional boarders who rented space in the house, because Charles's carpenter's wages and Mary's income and the occasional boarder together added up to working-class stability. Not comfort, not ease, but stability. Enough. After years of not enough, enough felt like abundance. And then there was Mary. Mary Amelia Ingalls was 30 years old in 1895. Blind since she was 14, she'd graduated from the Iowa Braille and Sight-Saving School in Vinton, Iowa, in 1889. After 8 years of rigorous education that Charles and Caroline had sacrificed for, scraped for, gone without for. She had come home from that school with a genuine education, literate in Braille, musically trained, intellectually accomplished. She could have been bitter. She could have been diminished. She was neither. Mary lived in that house on 3rd Street as a full member of the household, not a burden, not a helpless dependent, but a woman who contributed in every way her circumstances allowed. She made fly nets for horses. That detail is easy to gloss over, but stop and think about what it means. Fly nets, the mesh coverings that protected horses from insects during warm months, were in continuous demand on the plains, where horses were still the primary means of transportation and labour. Mary made them by hand. The income she earned from this work helped sustain the household as surely as Charles's carpentry did. She knew every inch of that house by touch. She knew where each piece of furniture stood, where each door was, which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't. She moved through the rooms of 210 3rd Street with the quiet confidence of someone who had made a map of the world in her hands and carried it always. She attended church with her parents. She listened to sermons she could not see but absorbed completely. Yes, she lived a life that had every right to be considered diminished and refused that consideration entirely. What Mary felt about her life, about the blindness, about never marrying, about the gap between the future she'd imagined at 14 and the one she actually lived, we don't fully know. She didn't leave a written record of sufficient depth to answer that question. What we know is that the people around her described her as composed, as faithful, as a woman who had made a kind of peace with her circumstances that most people never achieve. In the evenings in that house, Caroline would often read aloud. Books, newspapers, whatever was available. Mary would sit and listen, and Charles would sometimes play his fiddle, and the sound of it would settle over the house like something warm and familiar, like something that had always been there and always would be. In 1894, something changed in that house, not loudly, not with a dramatic farewell or a breaking of something irreplaceable, but permanently. On July 17th, 1894, Laura and Almanzo Wilder loaded their belongings into a wagon and drove south out of Smet. They were headed to Mansfield, Missouri, a 40-acre farm in the Ozark Hills, 650 miles away. Laura was 27 years old. She had a daughter, Rose, who was 7. She was leaving her parents' house for what turned out to be the last time she would ever call South Dakota home. 650 miles in 1894 was not a distance. It was a separation. There were no telephones in rural Missouri or rural South Dakota. There were letters, but letters travelled slowly, arrived unreliably, and said only what the writer chose to put down on paper and what the distance between sender and recipient allowed to remain unsaid. There was no way for Laura to know, or in real time, how her father was doing. There was no way for Charles to know in real time how his daughter was managing. They communicated across that distance the way frontier families always did, with carefully composed letters that were cheerful in tone and careful with the truth. How Charles felt about Laura leaving, the daughter who would eventually make him immortal, the daughter who was most like him in temperament, the one who had his restlessness and his humour and his inability to accept a horizon without wondering what was on the other side of it. We can only guess. He did not write about it in any surviving document. He kept his face toward the fire as he always had. What we know is that two of his daughters stayed close. Carrie, Caroline Celestia Ingalls, remained in the South Dakota region, close enough to visit, close enough to reach in a reasonable time if something went wrong. And Grace, the youngest, the one who had been born in 1877 and had grown up watching the whole family settle into Smet the way seeds find their final place in soil. Grace stayed too. October 16th, 1901. Grace Ingalls, 24 years old, married Nathan Dow in the parlour of the house at 210 3rd Street SW. Think about what that means for a moment. Not a church ceremony, not a grand social event. A wedding in the family parlour. In the room that Charles had built, in the house that was the first real home the Ingalls family had ever truly owned. Grace Ingalls stood in her parents' parlour and took her vows in front of the family who had gathered there. And Charles Ingalls, 65 years old, still straight-backed, still warm-eyed, his hair grey now and his movements a little slower than they had once been, was present for it. Manchester, South Dakota, where Grace and Nathan Dow would make their home, was only 7 miles from Smet. 7 miles. For a family that had spent decades measuring distances in states rather than miles, 7 miles was nothing. 7 miles meant Grace could visit. 7 miles meant that if something happened, if Ma needed help, if Pa needed something, Grace was close enough to be there before the worry had fully settled in. It was, in its quiet way, a kind of answered prayer for Caroline, her youngest daughter, married in her parlour, living 7 miles away. Not scattered across 650 miles of railroad track and unanswered letters. Present. The house felt full that day. The fiddle was almost certainly played. And then October turned to November, and winter came to Smet the way it always did. Without apology and without warning, and Charles Ingalls, 65 years old, went back to his work and his church and his lodge and his quiet routines. When the federal census taker came through Smet in June of 1900, he recorded 3 people living at 210 3rd Street SW. Charles P. Ingalls, age 64, occupation, carpenter. Caroline F. Ingalls, age 60, Mary A. Ingalls, age 34. 3 people in a house built for more. 3 people who had been a family of 7 when they first came to Dakota Territory in 1879, who had buried a son, watched daughters marry and scatter, weathered winters that killed stronger people, and arrived at this quiet census morning in the settled dignity of a household that had endured. Charles was the oldest man of his generation in town who had been there from the beginning. He was a founding church member, a former justice of the peace, a respected carpenter, a mason. The 1898 local history biographical sketch had described him with the kind of language reserved for men the community had decided to honour. Honest in his dealings, kind and courteous as friend and neighbour. Ja, honest, kind, courteous, not wealthy, not powerful, not a man who had conquered the frontier in the way the legend suggested, but a man who had lived in a community for 20 years and left it better than he found it, who had built things that still stood, who had served when asked to serve, who had shown up Sunday after Sunday, year after year, to the church he had helped found, and played his fiddle in the house he had built, and kept his word in every dealing anyone could document. That is what the wanderer became when the wandering was over. But here is the thing about 64. 64 in 1900, for a man who had spent 40 years doing what Charles Ingalls had done, was not the same as 64 today. Modern medicine has a name for what was happening inside Charles Ingalls' chest during those years. Chronic congestive heart failure, likely compounded by decades of hypertension from physical strain, poor nutrition during the lean years, and the kind of repeated physiological stress that the frontier had been exacting from his body since before he was 40. In 1900, they had no name for it. They had no treatment for it. They simply called it heart trouble when it finally became impossible to ignore. In the years around 1900, the decline was gradual. A man who had worked hard all his life slows down. He takes shorter days. The carpentry work becomes less frequent, not by choice but by necessity. Some mornings, the body just doesn't have what it used to have. The shortness of breath that comes with heart failure is insidious. It arrives so slowly, with such patience, that a man can almost convince himself it is simply age, simply ordinary tiredness, simply the body's reasonable response to 64 years of living. Caroline noticed. She always noticed. She was the kind of woman who watched carefully and said little, who stored information the way a careful farmer stores grain, against a future need. She watched her husband's colour and his breathing, and the way he moved through the house, and she adjusted what she could. The meals, the workload, the quiet negotiations of a household where one person is beginning to need more than they are accustomed to asking for. Mary noticed too, blind to the visual world but not to the sonic one, the rhythm of Charles breathing across the dinner table, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs growing heavier and slower than they used to be, the moments when he sat down earlier than he once would have and didn't pick up the fiddle afterward. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't quite been before, and outside the window the South Dakota winter was doing what South Dakota winters do, pressing against the glass with a cold patience that does not negotiate and does not hurry. Something was coming. It was coming slowly. And in the house on 3rd Street, among 3 people who had survived everything the American frontier had thrown at them, the one thing none of them could quite bring themselves to name out loud was gathering in the corners of the rooms like the first snow. Stay with me. Because in Chapter 3, the illness has a name and a face. The letters going south to Missouri become more urgent, and a man who spent 40 years refusing to give up begins the one fight he cannot win on stubbornness alone. Say, something was gathering in the corners of the rooms. That is where Chapter 2 left us. Standing in the house on 3rd Street, listening to the South Dakota winter press against the glass, watching Charles Ingalls sit down a little earlier than he used to and not reach for the fiddle afterward. That weight in the air was not imagination. It was not the weather, and it was not old age in the ordinary dignified sense. It was something specific, something biological, something that had been building in the walls of Charles Ingalls' heart for decades, long before anyone in that house had a name for it. By the spring of 1902 it had a name. The name was heart trouble. That was the language of 1902. That was how the death certificate would record it, how the Smet news would report it, how Caroline would probably have said it to the neighbours when they stopped by the gate to ask how Charles was doing. 2 plain words, heart trouble. As if the heart were simply a thing that had gone a little wrong and might be fixed with the right amount of rest and the right kind of tea. It could not be fixed, and everyone in that house knew it before the doctors said so out loud. To understand what was killing Charles Ingalls, you have to understand what his body had been asked to do for 66 years, and specifically for the last 40 of them. The human cardiovascular system is not designed to absorb what the American frontier demanded of it. Charles had spent decades doing the kind of labour that starts before dawn and ends after dark, the kind of work that puts a man face down in exhausted sleep every night because there is genuinely nothing left in the body to keep him upright. He had broken sod by hand in Dakota territory, where the root systems of a native grasses had never been turned in 10,000 years. He had raised barns in weeks when the weather allowed it and in days when it didn't. He had walked behind ploughs through heat that came off the prairie like an open furnace, and he had hauled firewood through cold so deep it cracked the bark off trees. He had been hungry, not occasionally, not in the polite way people call themselves hungry before dinner, but genuinely, physically hungry during the lean years in ways that depleted his body's reserves and never fully replaced them. And through all of it, his heart had kept beating, faithfully, without complaint, the way a working horse keeps pulling because it is built to pull and because nobody has given it permission to stop. But organs that are asked to work at the edge of their capacity for decades do not fail dramatically. They fail slowly. They fail the way a rope frays, one fibre at a time, invisible until the morning you pick it up and it comes apart in your hands. What physicians in 1902 called heart trouble was, in the language we use today, most likely chronic congestive heart failure, the gradual weakening of the heart muscle until it can no longer pump blood efficiently through the body, causing fluid to accumulate in the lungs and limbs, causing breathlessness that arrives first with effort and then with rest, and finally with sleep. The treatments available in Smet, South Dakota in 1902 were essentially two. Digitalis, a plant-derived medication that could sometimes strengthen the heart's contractions, but was as often ineffective or dangerous at the wrong dose, and rest. There were no blood pressure medications. There was no cardiac surgery. There were no hospitals within practical reach for a man in Charles Ingalls' condition. And even if there had been, hospitals in 1902 were primarily for acute injuries and surgical emergencies, not for the management of chronic disease in aging men. More than 90% of Americans who died in 1900 died at home. Charles Ingalls would be no different. Here is the thing that the myth of the indestructible pioneer obscures. The body always keeps the account. Every winter that demanded more than a man had. Every summer of half rations. Every season of labour that would have been too much even in full health. All of it goes somewhere. None of it is erased. And by the spring of 1902 the account was being settled. The Smet News would later describe Charles Ingalls' final period as a lingering illness of several weeks. Those 5 words contain everything and say almost nothing. They are the language a small-town newspaper uses when there is no other language available, when the reality is too intimate, too prolonged, too domestic to fit into the white space of a column. Or what several weeks actually looked like in the house at 210 3rd Street was this. A man who'd been slowing for months finally stopped moving altogether. He took to his bed. The bedroom that had been a place of rest became the entire world. The walls, the window with its view of the street he had built, the sound of Smet going on outside in the ordinary way that towns go on, even when someone inside one of their houses is dying. And Caroline had been preparing for this without allowing herself to think of it as preparation. She had been watching Charles with the vigilance of a woman who has spent 42 years learning to read one person's body the way a farmer reads the sky, not for what it says now, but for what it will say in an hour, tomorrow, next week. She had noticed when he began sleeping longer. She had noticed when the breathlessness arrived, not just after climbing the stairs, but after crossing the room. She had noticed the swelling in his ankles and the way the colour left his face in the mornings and didn't fully return. She did not say these things aloud. That was not Caroline's way. But she adjusted everything quietly and completely. The meals became smaller and softer, household noises gentler, the front room rearranged so that Charles didn't have to climb stairs more than necessary. She converted the habits of a lifetime into the habits of a caregiver, without being asked and without ceremony. And then, one morning in the spring of 1902, she called for the doctor. Because whatever she had been managing quietly in the household for months had moved past the point where quietness was enough. Here is the thing that every person who has ever watched a parent fail understands, and that no book about pioneer resilience has ever quite captured. There is a specific, that a terrible moment when you realise that the person lying in the bed is not going to get up from it again. It does not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It does not arrive with the gravity the moment deserves. It arrives sideways during an ordinary task, changing a pillow, bringing a glass of water, hearing a particular quality of breathing that is different from yesterday, in a way you cannot name but cannot deny. And in that moment, you have to make a decision about what to do with what you know. Caroline made 2 decisions. The first was to stay. The second was to send word south. The first decision required no deliberation. Caroline Ingalls had been beside Charles Phillip Ingalls since February 1st, 1860. 42 years of marriage, 42 years of moving and building and losing and starting over, of 42 years of his voice in the house and his boots at the door and his fiddle on Sunday evenings when the work was done. Leaving that bedside was not a possibility she entertained. The second decision, the telegram, was the one that would change everything for a daughter 650 miles away. Before the telegram goes south, let us stop for a moment in that house. because there is another woman in it whose story tends to disappear in the shadow of the larger one, and she deserves to be seen. Mary Amelia Ingalls was 37 years old in the spring of 1902. She had lived in that house since she was 14 years old, since the illness that took her sight, since the world went dark and never came back. She'd educated herself at the Iowa Braille and Sight Saving School in Vinton, Iowa. She had come home from that school with a real mind, carefully trained, and she had used it every day since in the ways her circumstances allowed. She knew every room of 210 3rd Street by touch and sound. She knew the quality of light through the windows by the warmth it left on her hands. She knew her father's footsteps from anywhere in the house, and now, in the spring of 1902, she knew from the sound of those footsteps, slower, heavier, stopping too often on the way up the stairs, that something was ending. Mary could not see her father's face growing thinner, but she could hear when his breathing changed. She could feel, when she sat beside his bed and held his hand, the difference between the hand of a working carpenter and the hand of a man whose body was drawing its resources inward. She was present for all of it, every day, in the house she had never left, in the life she had built within the boundaries that blindness gave her. What Mary felt during those weeks, the particular grief of watching a parent die while you cannot see their face, the fear of what comes after when your entire world has been structured around two people and one of them is leaving. We cannot fully know. She left no diary, no letters of sufficient depth to answer those questions. What we know is that she was there. She was steady. She was, in the way of people who have already survived enormous loss, present for this one. Somewhere in early June 1902, the decision was made to send the telegram. The telegraph office in Smet was on Main Street. A few blocks from the house, someone, it may have been Carrie who was in the region, it may have been Caroline herself or the doctor or Grace, who was only 7 miles away in Manchester, walked through the June air to that office and paid for the words that would travel south along the wire, faster than any horse, faster than any train, to Mansfield, Missouri. We don't have the exact text. No copy has survived, but the message, whatever its precise wording, said what all such messages have always said. Come now, there is not much time. Those words left Smet and moved through the telegraph network in the compressed time of electricity. Hours, not days. And somewhere in the Ozark Hills of Missouri at Rocky Ridge Farm they arrived. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 35 years old in June 1902. She had been living in Mansfield, Missouri since the summer of 1894, when she and Almanzo had loaded everything they owned into a wagon and driven south in search of a life that the Dakota plains hadn't been able to give them. That was 8 years. 8 years of letters, of distance, of a relationship with her parents conducted in ink on paper and carried by the postal service across 650 miles. 8 years in which she had not come home. That distance was not indifference. Let that be clear. Laura Ingalls loved her father in the specific, bone-deep way of a child who grew up watching a man try his absolute hardest and fail again and again and love his family through every failure. She had inherited his humour and his restlessness and his stubborn belief that the next season would be better. She had carried his voice in her memory like a piece of music you can't stop hearing. The fiddle, the stories, the particular way he had of making a hard day sound like the beginning of something good. But love at 650 miles, in an era before telephones reached rural farms, was a different kind of love. It was a love conducted at a distance that made spontaneity impossible. You couldn't simply drive over. You couldn't call. You could write a letter and wait a week for the reply and write back and wait again. You could know your father was aging and feel the worry of it in your chest every time a letter took longer than usual to arrive. But you could not be there in the ordinary daily way that proximity allows. No, Rocky Ridge Farm was not a wealthy operation in 1902. Laura and Almanzo were still deep in the work of establishing it, clearing land, managing livestock, building the farm into something that could sustain them. Almanzo, partially paralysed since 1888 from the lasting effects of diphtheria, walked with a cane and managed what he could manage. but the farm demanded constant physical attention that fell heavily on both of them. Their daughter Rose was 15, old enough to help, too young to carry the whole thing alone. A train ticket from Mansfield, Missouri to Smet, South Dakota, in 1902 was not a small expense. It required multiple connections. It required days in transit. It required leaving the farm, leaving the livestock, leaving everything that depended on daily human presence, and trusting that it would still be standing when you returned. When the telegram arrived, all of that became irrelevant. There is no surviving account of what Laura did in the hours after she read those words. No diary entry for that day has been found. No letter from that period describes what the farm looked like when she left it, or what she said to Almanzo, or what Rose's face looked like as her mother packed a bag and went to catch a train. What we know is that she went. And she went because there are moments when the arithmetic of practicality simply stops mattering. When the cost of the ticket and the state of the farm and the 100 practical objections that common sense raises all fall silent in the face of a single overriding fact. Her father was dying, and she was not there. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway connected the Midwest in 1902, and a passenger travelling from Missouri to South Dakota would have made her way north through a series of connections, each one requiring a transfer, a wait, another platform, another train. The journey would have taken the better part of 2 days at minimum, likely more. Hundreds of miles of prairie unreeling outside the window in the slow, relentless way of train travel. The farmland of Iowa giving way to the flatter expanses of Dakota. Yeah, the sky opening up wider the further north you went until it was the sky Laura had grown up under. Enormous and indifferent and achingly familiar. Here is the cruelest part of a long-distance journey, when someone you love is dying. The train moves at the same speed regardless of your urgency. It does not go faster because you need it to. It stops at every small station between here and there, Ottumwa, Des Moines, Sioux Falls, one anonymous water tower after another, and you sit in your seat and watch the conductor's face for any sign that the train is ahead of schedule, and it never is. And you look out the window at the darkening landscape and you do the arithmetic again because you have been doing it since you left, calculating distance against time against the word come now, and what now means when you are 2 states away. What Laura knew, what she must have known, is sitting in that rattling car with the soot coming in through the windows, is that she had left too late, not because of any failure of love or will, because she had been 8 years away, because the distance was what it was, because 650 miles in 1902 was not a number. It was a wall, and she was going to reach the other side of that wall, or she was going to be too late. And she would not know which until the train pulled into De Smet, and someone was waiting on the platform to tell her. She would not know which, and neither would you, sitting in that seat, until the train stopped. She made it. The outline of the historical record, fragmented, partial, imperfect as it is, points toward the same conclusion. Laura Ingalls. Wilder reached De Smet in time. She was there. She sat beside the bed in the house on 3rd Street in the room her father had built. And her sister. And she was present for the closing of the circle that had begun in Wisconsin in 1836, when a baby boy was born in the state of New York, who would grow up to move his family across the continent and build something in the American grass and call it home. On Sunday, June 8th, 1902, at some point in the afternoon, Charles Phillip Ingalls drew a breath and did not draw another. He was 66 years old. He had been married for 42 years to the same woman who was holding his hand. His blind daughter was in the room, his most famous daughter, who had travelled 650 miles in the long way that distances are travelled when you have no choice, was there. Outside the window, De Smet went on in the ordinary Sunday afternoon way of a small town. The light on the street the particular gold of early June, the cottonwood trees full and moving in whatever breeze came off the plain. The sky, the enormous prairie blue that Charles Ingalls had spent a lifetime looking up at from the various patches of ground he had tried to make his own. Inside, the house on 3rd Street went very quiet. The death certificate would record the cause simply, heart trouble. 2 words for 40 years of consequence. 2 words for the grasshopper plagues and the hard winters and the sod that broke a man's back, and the homesteads that broke his bank, and the years of carrying a family on sheer will when there was nothing else left to carry them with. 2 words for the price of the American frontier, paid in the currency of the body, settled in the silence of a June afternoon in a South Dakota house that still stands today. Charles was gone. Caroline did not move for a long time. 42 years is not a number, it is a life. It is the sound of a particular set of footsteps so well known that you stop hearing them as sound and start hearing them as presence, as the fundamental background noise of your own existence. And then one afternoon that noise stops, and the silence is not simply quiet. It is the specific total silence of something that will never again be otherwise. Mary sat very still, her hands in her lap, her sightless eyes steady. She had known this was coming. She'd been knowing it for weeks, in the way of a person who has learned to read the world through every sense but sight. But knowing and arriving are different things. The house felt different now. The same rooms, the same walls, the same floors that Charles had laid, but different in the way that places change when the person who made them is gone. And Laura, who had travelled 650 miles in a race she almost lost, sat in her father's house and understood for the first time in her adult life what it meant that she had moved away. There are 2 days between June 8th and June 10th, 2 days between the death and the funeral, 2 days in which the house on 3rd Street was the centre of everything, the neighbours coming to the door, the first Congregational church being notified, the Masonic lodge receiving word that one of its own had passed, and that the Brotherhood's duty was now owed to his widow and his children. 2 days in which Caroline Ingalls, 62 years old, wife of 42 years, mother of 5, grandmother, founder of a church, survivor of the American frontier, received the condolences of the town her husband had helped build from empty Prairie. And 2 days in which the brothers of the Smet Masonic Lodge put on their ritual aprons and prepared to give Charles Ingalls the dignified farewell that the frontier itself had never provided. The formal, sacred ceremony of a brotherhood that keeps its promises to the dead. On Tuesday morning, June 10th, 1902, the doors of the First Congregational Church opened. What happened inside those walls? Who stood where? What the Masonic brothers carried? How a town says goodbye to a founding father, and what it cost the family who had to receive all of it, while also holding the impossible weight of their own grief. That is, Chapter 4. And there is one more question that the church records, the cemetery files, and the Masonic lodge accounts cannot answer. It is the question that historians have been asking since scholars first looked carefully at the Ingalls story. It is the question that Laura herself never answered in anything she wrote for the rest of her 90 years of life. Why did she never write about this? 9 books, 800,000 words, give or take. The most faithful, detailed, affectionate portrait of a father in American literature, and not a single sentence about the June afternoon in 1902 when the man she called Pa stopped breathing in the house he built. Not one word. The answer to that silence, and what it cost her to keep it for the next 55 years, is something we will get to. But first, the funeral. The house went quiet on a Sunday afternoon, June 8th, 1902, 3 o'clock. The light coming through the windows at 210 3rd Street SW was the particular gold of early summer on the South Dakota plain. Wide, unhurried, falling across the floorboards that Charles Ingalls had laid himself, over the furniture his hands had made, and onto the face of a woman who had been married to the same man for 42 years and who now was not. Caroline did not move for a long time. There was nothing in the protocol of grief that required her to move immediately, and she did not. She had done everything that could be done. She had given everything that could be given. And now the room held a different kind of silence than the silence of the previous weeks. Not the silence of a man sleeping through his illness, the shallow breath and occasional sound of a body still working, but the total, completed silence of a body that had finished its work. Mary sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap, her face still. She was 37 years old, and she had spent her entire life in this house learning the world through sound. She heard the silence too. She understood it before anyone had to say a word. Laura was in the room, She had come the way Chapter 3 described, the desperate train journey north, the arithmetic of distance against time, the terrible patience of a train that did not know what it was carrying. She had arrived before the end, which is the only gift that a 650-mile journey can give you when the timing is close enough to be cruel. She had been there for the final hours, though historians are careful to note that no surviving document tells us exactly how long she sat beside that bed before 3 o'clock arrived. What we know is that she was in the house when Charles Phillip Ingalls drew his last breath, and that she walked out of that bedroom carrying something she would not put into words for 28 years. Between a death and a funeral in a small South Dakota town in 1902, there were 2 days. Those 2 days were not empty, they were full of the specific, practical, relentless work that death creates even as it silences everything else. Someone had to notify the church. Someone had to notify the Masonic lodge. Someone had to go to the newspaper office and provide the details that would appear in both the Smet News and the Kingsbury County Independent, the obituary that would be the public document of a man's passing, the one that would survive in the archive when everything else faded. Grace and Nathan Dow arrived from Manchester 7 miles away. Carrie came in from the De Smet region where she'd been living. The house on 3rd Street, which had held 3 people through the long, quiet months of Charles's decline, suddenly held more of the family than it had in years. It was the kind of reunion that nobody wants, and everybody shows up for anyway, because the geography of grief is the one geography that overrides all other logistics. Caroline moved through those 2 days with the same composed efficiency that had defined her entire adult life. There was food to arrange for the family gathered in the house. There were the Masonic brothers who came to offer their condolences and to confirm the arrangements, because Charles had been their brother, and the lodge had a duty to discharge, and that duty would be honoured on Tuesday morning. There were neighbours who knocked at the gate and were received at the door and spoke the words that people have always spoken at such moments, and Caroline said the words back that she was supposed to say, and behind her composed face she was doing what she had always done in the face of disaster. She was managing. Laura watched her mother do this, 35 years old, standing in the house she'd grown up in, watching the woman who had followed Charles Ingalls across 4 states and 2 territories and 20 moves hold his death together with both hands the way she'd held everything else together, by refusing to let it fall apart in front of anyone who didn't need to see it. On Tuesday morning, June 10th, 1902, De Smet's first Congregational church opened its doors. This was the church that Charles Ingalls had helped found 20 years earlier. He was one of 8 charter members who had signed their names to its establishment in 1882, and before that he had offered the floor of his own store building for the congregation's first services, in those early years when De Smet was still more prairie than town, and the church had no building of its own to meet in. He had been in that congregation for 2 decades, every Sunday, until his legs gave him trouble and then until his heart gave him everything. The congregation filled the pews. The De Smet News would record what happened with the plain language of a small-town newspaper that understood its own community. The funeral was largely attended by the many friends of the deceased and of the family. Largely attended. 2 quiet words for a significant thing. Charles Ingalls had arrived in De Smet in 1879, when the town was being platted on empty ground, when the streets existed on paper before they existed in dirt. He had been one of the first families. He had served as justice of the peace. He had founded the church. He had built houses whose frames were still standing, whose joints were still tight, whose doors still swung true on their hinges. He had been in this town for 23 years, which was most of the town's entire life. The people who filled those pews knew his name the way you know the names of things that were there when you arrived and are still there when you look up. The cottonwood tree at the end of the street, the hill at the edge of town, the man with the hammer who built half of what you're standing in. The Ingalls family sat in the front of that church. Caroline, 62 years old, Mary, 37, blind, present and still, Grace with her husband Nathan, who had been married only 8 months and was learning what it meant to be part of an Ingalls gathering. Carrie, 31, Laura, 35, who had last sat in this town's church as a girl, as a young woman, as someone who still lived here and could see her parents whenever she needed to. That person, the Laura who lived here, was gone, had been gone since 1894. What sat in that pew on Tuesday morning was the Laura who had come back for the last time. The obituary that ran in both the Smet News and the Kingsbury County Independent in the days following June 8th was the kind of document that small-town newspapers produced with regularity and care, a structured accounting of a man's life, shaped by the conventions of what you said about the dead in public in 1902, when the audience was his neighbours and his church community and the people who had watched him work. It noted that Charles Ingalls had been born in New York State, that in 1879 he had brought his family to Smet, that he had died on Sunday, June 8, 1902, after a lingering illness of several weeks, and then it said what the town had decided about him, that he was honest and upright in his dealings, that he was kind and courteous as friend and neighbour, honest, upright, kind, courteous, not wealthy, not powerful, not a man whose name was on buildings or whose portrait hung in a courthouse, but a man whose neighbours, in given the opportunity to say one thing about him in print, chose to say that he had dealt fairly with everyone and been good to the people around him, that he had kept his word, that he had been pleasant to know. There are worse things to have said about you when the time comes. After the church service, something happened that the Smet News recorded in a single sentence, a sentence so matter-of-fact in its language that you could almost miss how significant it was. The Masonic fraternity who were in attendance in body took charge of the funeral, in attendance in body. The entire lodge, assembled and present, not merely represented by a handful of members but gathered together in formal brotherly obligation. They took charge. To understand what that meant for the family at the front of that church, you have to understand what the Masonic lodge was in a small frontier town at the turn of the century. It was not primarily a social club. It was a system of mutual obligation, a brotherhood whose most fundamental promises were made not in good times, when help was easy to give, but in the hardest times, when the cost of keeping your word was real. The lodge promised its members a dignified burial. It promised that when you died, your brothers would be there, not because they happened to be available, but because they were duty-bound to come, and it promised that your widow would not be left entirely without recourse. The brothers of the Smet Masonic Lodge put on their ritual aprons and stepped forward. The Masonic funeral rite in 1902 was a formal ceremony of great symbolic weight, conducted according to procedures that had been unchanged for generations. It spoke of mortality, the acknowledgement that every man who stood in that procession would one day be where Charles was lying. It spoke of brotherhood, the bonds that did not break when the body failed. And at its centre was a symbolism that every Masonic brother present understood, the idea of raising, of a man being raised from the darkness of death toward the light of what the lodge called eternal life, carried forward not by his own strength, which had given out at last, but by the strength of the brothers who surrounded him. For a congregation that had watched Charles Ingalls build things for 20 years, there was something right in this. He had always been the man who showed other men how to raise a structure. He had been the one who knew how wood should be jointed, how a frame should be set, how a building should stand against the South Dakota wind, and now the brothers were raising him in the only way left available. They filed out of the First Congregational Church in formal procession and moved through the June streets of De Smet toward the cemetery on the hill. As De Smet Cemetery sits on elevated ground to the southwest of town, on a gentle rise that gives it the particular quality of Prairie cemetery landscape. The enormous sky, the wind that runs across the grass without obstruction, the sense of immense open space that the Dakota plains provide whether you want it or not. And from that hilltop, facing east, on a clear June morning in 1902, you could see across the town and beyond it to the open land where Charles Ingalls had once filed a homestead claim on 157.25 acres, where he had broken ground that had never been broken, where he had built the claim shanty and watched the crops fail and watched them grow and finally proved up in 1886 after 5 years of the kind of effort that the Homestead Act required, and the Prairie made no easier. He never did succeed as a farmer. Not really, although not in the way he had always believed the next season might allow. The homestead is gone now, sold in 1892, absorbed into the landscape, no longer his. But the view of it from the hilltop where he was buried on June 10th, 1902, is essentially unchanged. The land is still there, flat and enormous and completely indifferent to what any individual man poured into it or took from it. The family stood around the open grave. Carolyn, who had followed this man to that land, and to a dozen different pieces of land before it, and who would live in the house he built for another 22 years after he was gone. Mary, who could not see the homestead to the east, but who had been carried there as a child and had grown up on that flat ground and had lost her sight in a house not very far from where she was standing. Grace the youngest, born on the plains, married now and 7 miles away and close enough to come whenever her mother needed her. Carrie, Laura. The Masonic brothers performed their rites, the words were said, the ritual was completed. And Charles Ingalls, the man who had spent 40 years looking for the right piece of ground and ended up here, was placed into the earth of the town he had helped build. The wind moved over the hilltop the way it always moves over that country, persistent, unhurried, with the particular sound of open space. There is a financial detail in the records that most people have never heard, and it says everything you need to know about the reality of that household on 3rd Street in the summer of 1902. The Masonic Lodge paid for the headstone, $72. That was the recorded expense from the lodge's financial accounts. $72 for the stone marker that would stand over Charles Ingalls' grave in the Smet cemetery. $72 that Carolyn Ingalls and her blind daughter Mary left in a house with Mary's modest income from making fly nets for horses, and whatever income the occasional boarders might provide, did not have to find. This is not a minor detail. It is a window into the actual economic circumstances of the Ingalls family at the time of Charles's death. The house on 3rd Street was owned outright. That was real. And that was genuine stability of the kind that Charles had never had before 1887. But the cash in the household, the liquid funds available to a widow in 1902 with a blind adult daughter and no male breadwinner, was not sufficient to cover a funeral headstone without help. The Brotherhood had made a promise. It kept the promise. Carolyn would remember this. She would remain a faithful member of the First Congregational Church, the other institution that had provided the community support system that made life in Smet possible for the rest of her life. She and Mary lived in that house for another 2 decades after Charles was buried on the hill, sustained by the boarders who came and went, and by the neighbours and church members and the Dow family in Manchester, and the Ingalls girls still in the region, who made sure the household on 3rd Street was never entirely without recourse. The frontier had broken Charles Ingalls' health and scattered his family across hundreds of miles, but it had also deposited him in a community that showed up in body when the time came, paid for the stone that marked his place, and took care of his widow in the years that followed. Sometime after June 10th, 1902, after the funeral, after the cemetery, after the neighbours had finished coming to the door, and the house had settled back into the particular quiet of a household that has absorbed a grief and is now learning to live around it, Laura Ingalls Wilder left Smet, South Dakota. She walked out of the house at 210 3rd Street for the last time. The historical record of what re.docx's timeline confirms is stark and specific. Laura never returned to Smet until after her mother's death in 1924. 22 years. 22 years between the morning she left that house after her father's funeral and the next time she stood in it. Her mother Caroline would live until 1924. 22 more years in that house, in those rooms, in the town Charles had built. Mary would live until 1928, outlasting both of her parents by years that she would spend in the house they had shared. A woman who'd been cared for by that household, her entire adult life now being cared for by the household's continuation, by Carrie and Grace, and the Smet community that knew her name. Laura would know all of this from the letters. She would send letters and receive letters and manage the whole relationship with her family, from 650 miles of railroad track and ink on paper. The same way she had managed it since 1894, except now there was a grave on the hill to add to the things she knew were there but could not easily get back to see. She took the train south. She left Charles Ingalls' fiddle in her memory and his obituary in her bag and the sound of the Masonic brothers' voices at the graveside somewhere in the part of her mind where she stored the things she was not going to write about. Not yet. Not for a very long time. Because there was something she needed to do with all of this, and she had not yet figured out what it was. Here is the last piece of this chapter, and it might be the most important one. In 1930, 28 years after she left Smet for the last time following her father's funeral, Laura Ingalls Wilder picked up a pen and began writing down her memories. She was 63 years old. She had lost her father in 1902, and she would lose her mother Caroline in 1924 and her sister Mary in 1928. She had outlived 3 of the people who had been the centre of her first world, the world of the claim shanties and the covered wagons and the fiddle music on Sunday evenings, and in outliving them she had become the last person with a full, first-hand living memory of what it had actually been like. The writing that began in 1930 was not, at first, the children's books that millions would come to love. It was a manuscript she called Pioneer Girl, her life as she actually remembered it, in the adult voice of a woman looking back across 6 decades at a childhood and a family and an America that no longer existed, unguarded, detailed, including things she would later remove from the published versions, the harder truths, the failures, the distances, the grief that the mythology of the frontier required her to smooth down into something children could read and parents could feel good about. The Little House series that emerged from that original manuscript, published between 1932 and 1943, was a shaped thing, a chosen thing, a story that Laura and her daughter Rose and her publishers constructed with careful attention to what the America of the 1930s needed from a pioneer story. They needed resilience. They needed the fiddle. They needed Pa, playing music on the homestead and making everything better. They needed the particular warmth of a family that kept its humour and its faith through difficulty. Charles Ingalls, as Pa, gave them all of that. What they didn't get, what no reader of the Little House series has ever found, is the June afternoon in 1902. The house at 210 3rd Street going quiet. The Masonic brothers in their aprons walking through the June streets. The hilltop with the view east toward the land that never quite gave what it promised. Laura chose not to write about it. She never explained why. But the Little House books, all 8 of them, the most loving portrait of a father in American children's literature, exist because of what happened in Smet in June of 1902. They exist because a daughter needed to hold on to a man she had lost, needed to make him real and present again in the only way available to a writer, needed to give the world the pair she carried in her memory before the memory itself could fade. The grief of June 1902 is on every page of those books. It's just that you have to know where to look. The house at 210 3rd Street SW in Smet, South Dakota still stands. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society maintains it. You can walk through the rooms that Charles built, touch the walls he framed, stand in the kitchen where Caroline managed everything with such complete invisible competence. The floorboards creak in the same places they have always creaked. On the hill at the edge of town in the Smet Cemetery, there is a headstone. The Masonic Lodge paid $72 for it in 1902, and it has stood through 120 South Dakota winters since then, through blizzards that would have recognized in them the same fury that Charles survived in 1880 and 1881, through summers that would have known the same relentless heat that killed his crops and drove him to try again. The headstone faces east, toward the homestead. The view is still the same. Laura Ingalls. Wilder returned to Smet once more in her life. After 1924, after her mother's death, after the house had finally been released from the specific occupation of people she had grown up loving. By then she was in her late 50s. By then the Little House books were already being written in her mind, already assembling themselves from the material of memory that June 1902 had made urgent. She stood in the rooms of the house her father built. She was alone in them, or nearly so, and whatever she felt in those rooms, the grief, the guilt, the love that had survived 22 years and 650 miles, and the death of the man who played the fiddle, she kept it where she kept everything that mattered most. She kept it in her work, 9 books, millions of readers, generations of American children who grew up knowing Pa, the fiddle-playing pioneer, the tireless optimist, the father who could build anything and fix everything. He became, through Laura's deliberate and loving and carefully constructed art, one of the most beloved figures in American literature. But the real man, the 66-year-old carpenter who died in his own house on a Sunday afternoon in June, is buried on a hill in South Dakota. The masons put a $72 stone over him. The wind moves across the grass. The view east toward the homestead is unobstructed. And somewhere between that hillside and the 9 books that bear his shadow, there is a silence that Laura kept for the rest of her life. A silence that finally, after 90 years and 55 years of outliving him, she took with her. And in that silence, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear a fiddle. The train south from Smet left Laura Ingalls Wilder with a window and 650 miles of changing landscape to think in. She had done this before, not this exact journey, but the particular interior work of sitting on a train and feeling the gap between where you've been and where you're going stretch out beneath you like a physical thing, something with weight and texture, something you can't fold back up and put away. She had left Smet in 1894 in a wagon looking forward. She had come back in 1902 on a train, looking backward the whole way. Now she was leaving again, and this time there was a cemetery on a hill that hadn't been there on any previous departure, and the house at 210 3rd Street was not going dark behind her, but staying lit, staying occupied by the 2 women she was leaving behind, the way she had always been leaving people behind, the way the geography of her life had required her to keep leaving and keep going and keep finding reasons to stay gone. She was 35 years old. Her father was in the Smet cemetery. Her mother and blind sister were in the house he built. She had 700 miles of railroad track to cross before she reached the farm in Missouri that she and Almanzo had been building for 8 years, that they were still building, that they might always be building. And in the part of her mind that was always watching, always cataloguing, always filing things away for some future she hadn't yet imagined, something was already beginning to take shape. She didn't know yet what it was. She would not know for 28 years. Carolyn Ingalls was 62 years old when Charles died, and she would live to be 84, 22 years. That is longer than most of the marriages that ended in the Smet cemetery in those decades. 22 years of South Dakota winters and springs, of Sunday services at the Congregational church that still had her name on the founding roll, of the specific domestic rhythm of a household that had lost its centre of gravity and had to find a new one. The practical arithmetic of the household at 210 3rd Street after June 1902 went like this. The house was owned outright, which was the one solid fact that prevented everything else from becoming crisis. There was no rent. There was no mortgage. Whatever Charles had built with his hands, the walls, the floors, the fitted joinery that was still tight and true, continued to shelter his family without asking anything in return except basic upkeep. What the household needed beyond shelter was income. Mary contributed what she could. The fly nets she made for horses, a modest but real addition to the household's resources. And Caroline did what frontier women had always done when male income disappeared. She opened her home to boarders. The 1910 census and the 1920 census both document it plainly. There are 2 lines in a federal ledger confirming what the family already knew. Other people's names listed at 210 3rd Street. Renters. The particular dignified necessity of a widow in the early 20th century rural America who had a house and no husband and a blind daughter to care for. The boarders came and went. The Green family, documented among the renters, became particularly close to Caroline and Mary. One of those arrangements where what begins as a financial transaction becomes something more human over time. The church community remained what it had always been, a network of mutual accountability and practical care, the same network that had produced the largely attended funeral and the $72 Masonic headstone, the same network that made living in a small town in South Dakota survivable in ways that living in the same circumstances alone could not have been. Carrie was close, within the South Dakota region, near enough to visit with frequency, near enough to come when her mother needed her. Grace and Nathan Dow were 7 miles east in Manchester, close enough to be present without being constant. The 2 younger sisters formed the practical support system that Laura, from 650 miles away, could not provide. They carried the physical weight of proximity, the winter check-ins, the spring planting help, the practical assistance that Caroline would never have asked for directly, but that Carrie and Grace gave without being asked. Laura wrote letters. She was good at letters. Careful, warm, detailed letters. The kind that maintained connection across distances that resisted connection. What those letters contained exactly, how frequently they arrived, what Caroline wrote back, most of that correspondence has not survived. The archive has the shape of the relationship but not its sound. What we know is that Caroline Ingalls, in the 22 years after her husband's death, never moved. She stayed in the house he built. She tended the life she'd made into Smet. She watched the town that had been raw Prairie in 1879 become an established South Dakota community in the 1920s, its founding generation aging into elders, their children born into a world that had never known the claim shanties, or the hard winter, or the grasshopper plagues. She was a founding mother of that town. And the town knew it, and there is a particular kind of dignity available to a woman who outlives the era she helped build, and lives long enough to be recognised as its witness. She died on April 20th, 1924. The De Smet News called it an unexpected death after a brief illness. She was 84 years old. She'd been married to Charles Phillip Ingalls for 64 years before he died, and a widow for 22 years after. She had followed him across 4 states and 2 territories and 20 moves, and she had outlasted all of it. The crop failures, the hard winters, the lost claims, the dispersed children, the slow death of the man she married in 1860. And in the end she died in the house on 3rd Street and was buried on the hill with him. Mary Amelia Ingalls outlived them both. She was 63 years old when she died on October the 20th, 1928, and the obituary reported the cause as pneumonia following a stroke. The double blow of a body that had been, by any medical accounting of the era, functioning well past what 19th century life expectancy predicted, for a woman who had lost her sight at 14 and lived her entire adult life as a dependent in the households of others. She had made fly nets. This sounds small, but it was not small. It was the one economic contribution available to a blind woman in South Dakota in the early 1900s, and Mary Ingalls had done it steadily, year after year, making the leather and cord nets that draped over horses' faces to keep the flies away in summer. The income was modest. The independence it represented was real. After Caroline died in 1924, the household at 210 3rd Street that had been the fixed point of the Ingalls family since 1889 finally dissolved. Mary could not live alone. She moved first to Grace and Nathan Dow's home in Manchester, 7 miles from De Smet, and then later to Keystone, South Dakota, where Carrie had settled. It was in Keystone that she had her stroke. It was there that her body finally gave way to the pneumonia that followed. She was buried in De Smet, back on the hill with her parents, as she had always expected to be. What were Mary Ingalls 26 years after her father's death actually like? The historical record is frustratingly thin. We have the census entries, the obituary, the documented move from household to household after Caroline died. What we don't have is her voice. She never published anything. She never gave recorded interviews. The woman who had spent 8 years at the Iowa Braille and Sight Saving School, who had been educated in ways that most frontier women of her generation were not, left no written trace that has survived in accessible archives. She exists in the record as a set of facts: birth date, our blindness, fly nets, death date, grave location, surrounded by silence. Laura wrote about Mary. In the Little House books, Mary is warm and gentle and capable of extraordinary grace in the face of her blindness. She's a kind presence, a beloved sister, the occasion for some of Laura's most affecting writing. But that Mary exists in the books as a child and a young woman. The 40-year-old Mary, the 50-year-old Mary, the 63-year-old Mary who died in Keystone. She never appears. The books stop before they need to reckon with what blindness and dependency and aging actually looked like in a frontier family without resources. The warm portrait and the difficult reality are both true, and the books only contain one of them. There is a fact about the De Smet Cemetery that most people who love the Little House books have never been told. The Ingalls family plot on that hilltop contains 6 graves, and one of them is not an Ingalls. Charles Phillip Ingalls, 1836 to 1902. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls, 1839 to 1924. Mary Amelia Ingalls, 1865 to 1928. Carrie Ingalls, Swansea, 1870 to 1946. Grace Ingalls Dow, 1877 to 1941, and her husband Nathan Dow, and baby boy Wilder, Laura's son, the infant who lived 27 days in 1889 and died before anyone had given him a first name that survived in the public record. The child Grace noted in her diary as looking just like Manly. He was buried in the Smet cemetery in the summer of 1889, before the Ingalls family plot had taken its final shape, and there he stayed, through Charles's death in 1902, through Caroline's death in 1924, through Mary's death in 1928, through Carrie's death in 1946, through Grace's death in 1941. The unnamed baby is on that hill with the whole family. He never left. His mother left. Laura Ingalls Wilder is not buried in Smet. Amanza Wilder is not buried in Smet. Rose Wilder Lane is not buried in Smet. They are all three in the cemetery in Mansfield, Missouri, 650 miles south, in the ground of the state where Laura spent 63 of her 90 years. This is the quiet, definitive statement of Laura's life. She left South Dakota in 1894, and she never came back permanently, and when she died on February 10th, 1957, she was buried where she had lived rather than where she had come from. Her son is on the hill overlooking the homestead. She's in Missouri. The geography of their family tells the whole story of dispersion and irreversibility that the Little House books are too warm and too beloved to accommodate. Almanzo died in 1949, 8 years before Laura. He was 92 years old and had lived with his limp for 61 years, the legacy of that 1888 diphtheria that had taken so much from them both. Laura lived alone on Rocky Ridge for those 8 years after he was gone. The last person alive who remembered the fiddle music in the claim shanties, the last person alive who had held her father's hand as a child and watched him play music that made the blizzard seem smaller than it was. She died at 90, the most beloved children's author in American history, buried next to her husband in a Missouri cemetery 650 miles from the father she never wrote about losing. The Little House books are not lies. This is important to say plainly, because what follows is a list of corrections, and corrections can sound like accusations. They are not. Laura Ingalls Wilder made choices, deliberate, considered, artistically defensible choices, about what stories she wanted to tell and what stories she needed to keep. The result was literature that has outlasted her by nearly 70 years and shows no signs of disappearing. The corrections don't diminish that. They just add the texture that the literature chose to leave out. Her pa did not die suddenly. He suffered from cardiovascular disease, what the 1902 obituary called heart trouble, through a lingering illness of several weeks. The death that came on June 8th was not a surprise to the people in that house. It was the end of a long, difficult, breath-by-laboured breath decline that heart failure produces. There was nothing sudden about it. Pa was not a perpetual failure. By the time he died, Charles Ingalls was a respected De Smet townsman, a founding member of the First Congregational Church, a former justice of the peace, a carpenter whose work was still standing, a man whose obituary said he was honest and upright and kind. The homesteads failed. The man did not. He adapted. He settled. He built something lasting in De Smet even after the frontier had taken everything else from him. Pa was not young when he died. He was 66, which was above average life expectancy for a man of his birth year and his occupation. The men born in 1836 who survived childhood had a life expectancy of approximately 60 years. Charles outlived that benchmark by 6 years. By the brutal actuarial logic of his era, he had a full life. It is only measured against our modern expectation of male longevity, currently around 76 years, that 66 seems premature. The whole family was not gathered at the deathbed. Caroline and Mary were there. Grace and Carrie, living nearby in South Dakota, were almost certainly present. Laura arrived before the end. a desperate multi-day train journey that very nearly arrived too late. The family came together as best it could across the distances the frontier had imposed on it. But it was not the unified tableau that cultural memory tends to assume. Pa was not a successful homesteader. He filed his Dakota Territory claim in 1880 and proved up in 1886. That much is true, a genuine achievement. But before Dakota Territory, there had been a failed claim in Kansas, a failed claim in Minnesota, repeated relocations that left each location behind without the prosperity he had anticipated. He sold the Dakota homestead in 1892. The land he spent the most effort on belonged to someone else by the time he died. The Little House books, then, which present each homestead as part of a heroic journey, do not show the exits. The morning Charles Ingalls loaded the wagon and left yet another piece of ground behind. Laura did not write about Pa's death. Not in the Little House series, not in any published memoir, not in any surviving correspondence. The man who is the emotional centre of 8 beloved American children's books dies off page, in the gap between the last book's final chapter and the silence that follows. His most famous daughter, who had the literary gift and the long life and the subject matter and the audience, chose not to write about the June morning in 1902. The chapter that would have completed his story was never written. Laura was not wealthy when Pa died. She and Almanzo were in debt in 1902, still building Rocky Ridge Farm into something that would eventually sustain them. The prosperity associated with Laura Ingalls Wilder, the successful author, the beloved public figure, belongs to the 1930s and after, 30 years and more after her father's death. The woman who received the telegram about her father's condition in June of 1902 was a struggling farm wife who had to calculate whether she could afford the train fare. Scholars who have spent careers examining Laura Ingalls Wilder's archive have circled back to the same question for decades. Why did the Little House series end before Pa's death? The books conclude with these happy golden years in 1943, Laura's wedding in August 1885, the fiddle playing, the horses moving in the summer light, the life that is still ahead of everyone on the page. A posthumously published manuscript, the first 4 years, covers 1885 through 1889 and ends there. 4 years before Charles sold the homestead, 13 years before he died. The death of the man at the centre of the entire series happens in a silence the books never break, and 3 explanations have been offered, and all 3 are probably true simultaneously. The first is the publishing context. Harper and Brothers wanted children's literature. Children's literature in the 1930s and 1940s was expected to be uplifting, aspirational, warm, ending in earned happiness rather than grief and loss. A volume about Pa's declining health and slow death from cardiovascular disease and the family scattered across 650 miles was not a commercially viable children's book in 1942. The market shaped the story. The second is the narrative logic. The Little House series was always a coming-of-age story. Laura's childhood and youth, her growth into a woman who could choose her own path and make her own home. The arc completed with her marriage. Charles's death, happening when Laura was a 35-year-old woman living in Missouri, didn't fit the story those books were telling. Pa appears throughout as a presence in Laura's childhood, not as an aging man in his 60s. The books are about a girl becoming herself. They're not about a daughter losing her father. The third explanation is the one that sits in the chest and doesn't fully resolve. Laura was not a woman who avoided difficult truths because they were difficult. The Pioneer Girl manuscript, her original, unguarded autobiographical writing begun in 1930, contains material far harder than anything in the published books. She was capable of writing about pain. She chose not to write about this particular pain, and the choice appears to have been protected and permanent. Perhaps it was the distance. If she had not been there for enough of his final weeks, if she had arrived, as the logistics strongly suggest, barely in time, or arrived to find that certain conversations were already past, then writing about his death would have required writing about that. About the 650 miles, about the 8 years between her departure from Smet and his death, during which she saw him rarely, if at all, about the telegram and the train and the terrible arithmetic of arrival. about what it meant to have been the daughter who left and stayed gone. It is easier to keep Pa alive, playing the fiddle. In the books, he is always there, he never gets old, he never loses his breath, he never needs anyone to hold his hand because his cardiovascular system is failing. From 40 years of labour, the American frontier asked of him without recompense. Laura kept him playing the fiddle for the rest of her life on every page. That is the most human thing about her, and it tells you more about Charles Ingalls' real importance to his daughter than any chapter about his death could have. In the decades after Laura died in 1957, the story of Charles Ingalls went through 3 distinct interpretations, and understanding them helps explain why we needed this chapter in the first place. In the 1930s through the 1950s, Pa was exactly what the Little House books said he was: the fiddle-playing pioneer, the tireless optimist, the father who could build anything and fix everything, and make a hard winter feel survivable because he was standing in it with you. The books were accepted as essentially accurate memoir. The television series that launched in 1974 took that portrait and amplified it. Michael Landon's Pa became a cultural icon of idealised American fatherhood, wise and gentle and perpetually competent, managing every frontier crisis in 45 minutes, with his family's love intact at the end of each episode. That Pa bore increasingly little relationship to the documented historical record, but he was deeply useful, and he was deeply loved, and the gap between the icon and the man was not something the culture was ready to examine. In the 1970s and 1980s, social historians and feminist scholars began asking harder questions about what the frontier actually cost the people who lived it, particularly the women. They began noting that Carolyn's labour was systematically invisible in the books that centred Charles. They noted the homestead failure rates. They noted what lingering illness meant in a pre-antibiotic, pre-cardiological, pre-hospice household in 1902 South Dakota. They noted that 40% to 60% of homesteaders in Dakota Territory abandoned their claims, making Charles not an exceptional success story, but a statistically average failure who survived long enough to find a different kind of work. The most significant scholarly recalibration came in 2017. When Caroline Fraser's Prairie fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls, Wilder won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. Fraser brought the full weight of archival research and critical analysis to the Ingalls family story, not to demolish the books, which he treated with genuine literary respect, but to place them in the context of what they chose to exclude: the economic realities, the racial dimensions of settler colonialism, the gaps in the record that corresponded suspiciously to the hardest parts of the story, the way mythology is always constructed out of deliberate selection, and the question of who benefits from which version of the past. The current historiographical frontier is examining Charles Ingalls not as a symbol, either heroic or cautionary, but as a specific man whose specific life was shaped by specific forces. The Homestead Act's promises and failures, the cardiovascular consequences of physical labour without adequate nutrition, the economic structures of commodity agriculture that set families like the Ingalls up to struggle, and the cultural ideology of manifest destiny that made each failed homestead feel like a personal failing rather than a systemic one. Charles Phillip Ingalls was not Pa. He was a man who became Pa because his daughter needed him to be. The distance between those two things is where the real history lives. Here is the sentence that summarises everything across these 5 chapters, the one that Charles Ingalls' death certificate and his obituary, and his Masonic lodge records, and his wife's widow census entries, and his daughter's deliberately incomplete memoir combined to produce. Charles Ingalls' death from cardiovascular disease at age 66 was not a tragedy. It was a consequence. Just a consequence of the Homestead Act's promise of free land that came with insufficient acreage and no guarantee of adequate rainfall. A consequence of the commodity agriculture system that paid farmers barely enough to survive good years and nothing in the bad ones. A consequence of the Dakota winters that burned through body heat and body fat and left a man's cardiovascular system years older than his chronological age. the consequence of 40 years of physical labour without the nutritional support or the medical intervention that might have lengthened the life of those 4 decades worked lungs and that chronically strained heart. And it was a consequence of the American frontier ideology that told men like Charles Ingalls that if they worked hard enough and moved far enough and tried one more time, the land would reward them. It did not reward them. It took from them systematically, efficiently, across 4 states and multiple homesteads and repeated crop failures, and what it gave back was a townhouse owned outright, a modest carpenter's income, a respected name in a small Dakota community, and a death from heart failure at 66. The land beneath the Smet cemetery, where Charles rests on that hilltop facing east toward the homestead that was already someone else's by the time he was buried, was not free, and it was taken from the Dakota Sioux and the Yankton Sioux through treaties backed by military force. The free land of the Homestead Act was free only because the government had first made it available through dispossession. The silence in the little house books about this, about the people the prairies already belonged to when Pa looked out at what he called empty land, is the deepest silence in the whole story, and it belongs to the mythology rather than to Charles Ingalls alone, who was a man of his time seeing through the only lens his time provided. Laura Ingalls Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday, in the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge that she and Almanzo had been building since 1894. She had outlived her father by 55 years. She had outlived her husband by 8. She was the last person alive who remembered the sound of Charles Ingalls' fiddle in the small hours of a prairie winter. The last person alive who had heard him play Old Dan Tucker in a claim shanty while the blizzard announced itself outside the walls. She left behind 9 books, 8 published in her lifetime, 1 published posthumously, all of them stopping before the June morning in 1902 that she carried in the part of herself where she kept the things she was not going to write about. She left behind a grave in Missouri, distant 650 miles from her family's plot on the De Smet hilltop, where her unnamed son had been buried since 1889. The son no one spoke of, the son whose existence Rose didn't learn about until she was in her 70s, the son whose small headstone in the De Smet cemetery reads only baby son of A.J. Wilder, as if the frontier couldn't spare the ink for a name. She left behind the most beloved fictional portrait of an American father in the history of children's literature. A man who plays the fiddle, a man who always shows up, a man who can build anything and fix anything, and who makes the hard world feel survivable because he is standing in it with a song. That man was real. He was also a choice. A daughter chose to fix her father in the moment she most loved him. Young, strong, hopeful, playing music while the wind came across the prairie, rather than write him into the slow cardiovascular failure that killed him at 66 in the house he built on 3rd Street in De Smet, South Dakota, on a Sunday afternoon in June while the summer light came through the windows and fell across the floor. She made him immortal. She made him 25 years old forever, with a fiddle and a lamp and a family around him in the warm room. The real Charles, the one who failed and tried again and failed and tried again, the one who ran out of time at 66, the one whose daughter didn't write about his death, deserves to be known too. Not instead of Pa, alongside him. Because the real Charles Ingalls, with all his failures and his restlessness and his tired heart and the 650 miles between him and his most famous daughter, that man was also brave. He was also kind. He was also honest. The obituary got that much right. And the daughter who spent 28 years finding the words to tell his story and then told everything except the ending, loved him in a way that is as clear and as permanent as the headstone on the De Smet hilltop. The stone the masons paid for, the one that faces east, still standing. Hey, you made it to the end, and I want to take a second before we close this out, because you just spent a long time with a family that most of us grew up thinking we already knew. And if you're anything like me, you're sitting with a feeling right now that's a little hard to name. Not quite sadness, not quite anger, something quieter than both of those things. Because here is what we actually did tonight. We pulled Pa Ingalls off the page. Not to take him away from you, not to break something you love. The books are still what they are still beautiful. They still deserve every tear they ever earned from every kid who read them in the back seat on a long car ride, in a bedroom with a flashlight under the covers, in a classroom where a teacher handed them out and said, "Trust me." But tonight, you met the real man underneath the character. Charles Phillip Ingalls, born 1836 in New York, died June 8, 1902 in Smet, South Dakota, age 66, in the house he built with his own hands, of heart trouble. After a lifetime of hard labour on land that took more than it gave, buried on a hilltop where the wind comes in off the plain the same way it has come in for 120 years. He was honest. He was restless. He tried. He failed, and tried again, and failed again, and built something small and lasting at the end, and loved his family the way people love things when they know how easily those things can be lost, fiercely and with a fiddle, and without ever quite saying the words out loud. That's the man. And then there is his daughter, who spent 28 years figuring out what to do with his memory, who started writing in 1930 when she was 63 years old, and 3 of the people she had loved most were already in the ground, who gave America one of the most beloved fathers in the history of children's literature, a man who is always young, always capable, always there, and chose, deliberately, to stop the story before she had to write the chapter about losing him. I have thought about that choice for a long time, and I think it was the most human thing she ever did. When you love someone like that, when they are the person who made the world feel survivable when you were small, sometimes the only way to keep them is to freeze them in the moment you most needed them, to hold them there, in the warm room, with the fiddle, where the blizzard outside can't reach anyone. Laura kept Pa playing for the rest of her life. For every year she lived off to June 8th, 1902, all 55 of them, until she was 90 years old in a farmhouse in Missouri. She kept him playing on every page. That is grief, and that is love, and sometimes they are the same thing. Before you go, I want to hear from you. I want to know, did this change how you see the books? Do you love Pa more now, or differently, or the same? Or does knowing what Laura carried make the books feel, I don't know, heavier, more honest, more earned? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Drop your city and your local time while you're there. I read every single one. And I need to ask you one more thing, because this one keeps me up at night. We know Laura made it to Smet before her father died. What we don't know, what no letter, no diary entry, no archive anywhere has ever confirmed, is how much time she had with him before the end. Hours? A day? Less? So I want to ask you, how do you think she spent it? What do you think she said to him on that last train north, 650 miles between her and the man who had played the fiddle while the blizzard came? Tell me, seriously, tell me in the comments. If tonight was the first time you heard this story, if you grew up with the books and never knew any of this, hit subscribe. Because there is so much more of this family's real life that history tried to bury, and we are not done digging. We are nowhere near done. One last thing. There is a headstone in the Smet Cemetery on a hilltop in South Dakota facing east. The Masonic Lodge paid $72 for it in 1902 because the family couldn't. It's been standing there for over 120 years. The wind comes across the plain and hits it the same way it hit every claim shanty Charles Ingalls ever built, every homestead he ever tried, every piece of ground he ever broke his back on and then had to leave behind. It does not move. He was honest. He was kind. He tried. Good night.